Good afternoon, class.
Good afternoon.
We have now come to a point where our story is going to begin nearly 60 years ago in Fairbanks, Alaska. I think that's about the time some of your parents were born. And I was pastoring the Fairbanks Church and had decided that the ingathering was pretty important. In those days we did ingathering. Went from place to place, inviting people to participate in our mission program. And at that time, I decided that I would prepare my ingathering sermon several months ahead of time. Now that was a bit strange because I have never before or since prepared a sermon several months ahead of time. But it seemed important to me that I prepare something because it was a very important program. So several months before the time started, I sat down and prepared one and was looking forward to that weekend when I would have my sermon all prepared, and presumably I would be able to relax that Sabbath. Normally, it began early in the week preparing my sermon, but it was usually worked into Friday night and then got up early Sabbath morning to kind of finish it. At this point, I was going to have a vacation on Sabbath. I was going to have a chance to sleep in and have everything all ready. When I came to Sunday before the Sabbath we were talking about, I decided I better go through my paper, my outline, and begin warming it up, preparing for it. And when I did, it was cold. I read it through several times, and there was no warmth in it at all. And so finally I decided, well, I'm not going to be able to give this sermon. So I started working on another one. And I would work for a period of time, and I would think, now this is it. You understand, when you prepare a sermon, there has to be a sense of mission and purpose. There has to be the sense that this is the important passage for this week. And it started to come, and I would think, this is it. First thing you know, it would get cold. I would have the same sense toward it that I had regarding the others. So I would start again, and after a while it would get cold. Well, I wasn't sure what to do, but I worked all week trying to get a start. You understand, it was not trying to finish a sermon, but to begin, to be able to get something that I had the sense that this is the appropriate message for this Sabbath. Well, Friday came. I was no further along than I was on Sunday. And Friday afternoon arrived. I had some visits I needed to make that afternoon. And as I was visiting and as I was going, I kept thinking, what am I going to do? I have not been able to get even a start. And all of a sudden the thought came to me, well, you're not supposed to prepare this sermon. The Lord has some other plan for you. And when that thought came to my mind, I was able to relax for the first time that week. And that evening, I still had no idea what was going to take place, but I had a sense that the Lord has a plan, and whatever that plan is, He'll work it out. So that evening, I went to our church school teacher and asked her to have prayer with me about this. And I told her of the experience I've just told you, and that I had been impressed that the Lord would provide the sermon. But I had no idea what that would mean. And you understand, I'm still a young pastor. I'm in my first pastorate, so I'm not a very experienced person. When we were praying about it, while I was praying with her, all of a sudden a passage came into my mind just like that. When I got up, I said, Sister Montgomery, I now know what the text is. Isaiah 60, 1 and onward. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people, but the Lord shall arise upon thee. His glory shall be seen upon thee, and Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. And then it speaks about the forces of the Gentiles coming into us. The word forces actually has to do with the wealth. The wealth of the Gentiles will come into you. And I thought I was sure that was the passage. But I went home that evening, it was still early, and I refused to look up the text even, because I felt that the Lord, if he wanted me to work on this, he'd have given me more time. So it was my conviction that I was not to prepare the sermon, but at least he let me know what it was, what the text was. So I did not even look up the passage, because it seemed to me if I did, my mind would start working on it. I'd be preparing it, and the Lord had a different plan. The next morning I did sleep in, after all. No sermon prepared. And those days I was not about to just take a text and go into the pulpit and preach it. So that morning I got up and I did read the text. And then I went over to the church at Sabbath school time and was careful not to focus my mind on the passage until it was time for this church service. And when I arrived at the pulpit, there was the building was crowded. There was only one seat left, and a lady came in the front door, looked around, spotted that seat, and sat there. She had her little girl, 4 years old, with her. No special seat for her, but that wasn't too bad for a little 4-year-old to sit on her mother's lap. As she came in, I got to thinking, who is that? And as a pastor, you always want to know who's in your service. And I wondered, is this an Adventist lady? Is this a visitor from the States? Is it somebody from Fairbanks area? But I didn't have any idea. All I knew is that she had come in a little late, sat down before the service began, and then I was waiting for my time to come, and finally it came, and I stood up, opened my Bible to Isaiah 60, and read the text, and the Lord had given me a message. But as I was presenting the message, this lady was looking at me very intently and with a very pleased smile on her face. And I could tell she was with me at every point. She was right there. Well, I was naturally interested in learning who she was, so when I went out to greet the people, as she came through, she said, Pastor Moore, the Lord gave you that sermon for me. Well, I thought, I'm not surprised. He gave it to me for someone because it was not a sermon I'd prepared. I had no idea when I entered the pulpit how I was going to approach it. All I knew is a passage. But as it opened up, the Lord had given me a message. And when she said that, I thanked her and asked her name. Well, all she would give me was her first name, Pat. My wife's name was Pat. So that one wasn't too hard to remember. But I invited her to have lunch with us. And it was one of these situations where you knew absolutely that she wanted to come, but she said no instead of yes. And I said, well, why not? Well, she says, my husband's home. And I said, well, go get him. Come and join us. No, she said, he won't come. Well, I was so impressed that I told her, I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait our meal until such and such a time if you don't get there. I'm going to wait that long, and if you are not there by that time, I'm going to go ahead. We'll go ahead and eat. But I was sure she wanted to come, and that I was also sure the Lord was impressing me that she should come. Well, my wife and I were alone, waiting to start our lunch. No one had come. I don't remember what the time was, but I set it far enough away so that'd give plenty of time. She was certain he wouldn't, but I was sure that the Lord was impressing her to come, and that he impressed me to urge her. Well, about probably 1:30, I suppose that was probably the time I set, because we lived right next to the church, so it wasn't a matter of going home, you know, taking a half hour to get home or something. And where she lived was not far from the church. So we finally gathered at the table, and actually we gave extra time, whatever that was. I don't remember the exact time now. But just as we were having the blessing, the doorbell rang. I went to the door, was not at all surprised to see Pat, but there was this big man who took in the whole frame of the door, you know, and entering, took the whole space. And a big 6'3" man who was big in every way. Not fat, but big. And so I greeted him, said his name was Bud. And so we went to the table and we started. And I was seated by him. He was to my right. And I asked him, you know, who he was, and asked him a number of questions, found out that he was a former Adventist, and felt impressed that I should appeal to him to become an Adventist again. And found out that he was was working at the Daily Miner, the newspaper for Fairbanks Daily Miner. And as we talked, he said, Pastor Moore, could I talk with you sometime? Why, yes, of course, I said. When would you like to visit with me? Well, we set a time, and we were to meet in the church. He wanted to meet where it was private. And so we met in the church. And his story was a very interesting one. He had been a ministerial student in, I believe, Baptist church. I'm not sure just which one right now. That part I've lost. But he was studying for the ministry when he learned about Seventh-day Adventism and decided to leave the training program he was in and go to Atlantic Union College, which he did. And he and his wife were baptized and became students. He became a student at Atlantic Union College. But after they had been there a year or two, he became very unhappy with the college and with Adventism. And he left the college, decided to go as far away as he could. He got a job at the Fairbanks Daily Miner, way up in Alaska. He thought, well, we'll get clear out away from Adventism. That Sabbath morning, the 4-year-old daughter, who had not been in Sabbath school for 2 years, got up and said, take me to Sabbath school this morning, Mommy. And she said no, but over and over again she kept pleading, take me to Sabbath school. Finally, Pat said she decided, well, she would take them once, but she would not be coming back again unless things were, if she didn't appreciate it. And the fact is, she was not friendly toward Adventists at that time. And one of the problems that they had faced was they were very highly disliked in gathering, both the husband and wife. That morning, when she decided to finally, it was way after Sabbath school, it was a little late for church service, but when she finally decided to take her husband, Bud, swore and said, don't you let that blankety-blank preacher know where we live and know who we are. So all she would give me was her first name, and she would not indicate where she was or anything. So she came. But during that sermon, she was deeply impressed that this message was a message they needed. And it was an ingathering sermon. And ingathering was one of the things that had caused them to leave the church. They didn't like it. Well, the fact is that I had a session with Bud that Monday or Tuesday, a couple of days later, in the church. And I don't know ever having an experience like it before or since. And that's nearly 60 years ago. And it was really quite an amazing thing. Here, this big giant of a man was so weak he could not even pray. And the beads of sweat were on his brow. He wanted to pray, but couldn't. He was just unable to. I don't know how long I spent there, but I decided that I was not going to give up until he had prayed. You see, it was not as though he didn't want, it wasn't though he was refusing to. He wanted to, but couldn't. And finally, he prayed, and that broke the spell Satan had over his mind. And he wept and surrendered his heart to God. And never again after that do I remember him missing a church service or a prayer meeting. Indeed, he and his wife were with the ingathering group when we were ingathering, and doing so joyfully. But Satan had put an iron closure on his mind so that he was not able to do what he wanted to do. I met him again many years later. The 4-year-old girl, in the meantime, had grown up and had been killed in one of these, I think they call them four-wheelers. It had turned over on her and she had been killed. But But this was many years later, and he and his wife were still faithful. I met her at a camp meeting where I was asked to be a guest speaker, and that's how I happened to see him again. And it was probably 30 years afterward. And they were, of course, it was a sorrowful thing to lose their daughter, but they didn't lose their faith. And that was important. Now you say, why did you tell this story? Is this going to be a class about Brinsmead? Well, our subject today is Brinsmead. But I wanted to give you a little background as to how I happened to learn about Brinsmead. In 1959, we moved from Fairbanks, Alaska to Oroville, Tonasket District in the state of Washington. And I see a smile on a face or two of those who are acquainted with that district. As a matter of fact, I know Cammie is from there. And, oh yes. Well, at any rate, I moved to Oroville, and Tonasket was also in my district. The first Sabbath morning, by the way, well, no, I'll share that later. The first Sabbath morning, I attended church in Tonasket. And as I began preaching, there was a family there and a man with them, and all of them paid very close attention and were obviously delighted with the sermon. It was something that meant quite a bit to them. I had never met them before. In fact, I hadn't met any of the members before. And at the close of the service, they too said, "The Lord gave you that sermon." Well, it was not a sermon He'd given me just for them, because it was a sermon I had preached that day. I preached the same sermon that I had preached that day when Pat said, "The Lord gave you that sermon for me." And now I'm preaching it again, and a similar response. Well, I still didn't know who the people were, but I was invited to have lunch. My wife and I were invited to have lunch with the couple who had 2 children. And when we got there, we found out the man was there too. So all of them were there. At that point, I didn't know who the gentleman was, but that was Al Hudson. You've heard me mention his name. You'll hear it again. But Al Hudson, at that point, I had no idea who he was, but he was the real burr in the denomination saddle. I don't know if you've had horses or not, but to have a burr under a saddle is not a very comfortable thing. And he was one who was a challenge to the denomination. And when I finished my sermon, when he spoke to me, he said, "Well, Pastor Moore," he says, "why don't the other pastors preach that like that?" He said, "You're the only one who preaches that." And I made a note right then, this man has problems with the church. But I wasn't sure who he was or what he was. But within a short time, I found out. And Al Hudson is the one who is sort of the key to the story this morning, because Al Hudson tried his best to get me to become his preacher, so to speak. He was a printer. Al had taken the theology course and had not been given a pastorate, but he was a printer, and he was doing what he could with his print shop. He's the one who printed the Andreassen's letters. And so, but at the same time, I was trying to help him to change his attitude and his methods of approach. His concepts were generally good, but his feelings toward the church were negative, and at least toward the leadership of the church. And so we had been involved in a wrestling match for over a year by this time. By a wrestling match, I mean to say that our letters back and forth, he would write to me and I would respond, and he would write again and I would respond. My wife was very concerned, my health, because the only time I had to write to him was in the middle of the night, and she had been trying to get, help me to reform my pattern. And but Al had one time when he came to Tonasket, when he saw me, he said, I've found someone from Australia who has a real message. And he was quite excited. It was Bob Brinsmead. Now, Bob Brinsmead had learned of Whelan and Short's manuscript that they prepared for the denomination on 1888. And that manuscript was designed to show that the brethren did not accept the message of 1888, the Minneapolis message at that time. And he was the one who printed that, and then when Andreasen came along, he offered to publish his papers, which he did. But now he has found someone in Australia that he's eager to have become his preacher, the one who would be able to work with him doing the preaching. Well, Brinsmead wanted to come to the United States. I was not aware of this, but Al told me years later that he told him, Bob, you stay where you are until I let you know. Of course, Al would like to have him come to the States, but he wanted to arrange, first of all, he wanted to make arrangements for him to meet with the officers of the General Conference. But Bob didn't wait. And in February of 1951, Bob and his older brother John arrived at Al's place in Oregon. Al was not very happy because he wanted to have this arranged. He was involved with the General Conference officers, even though they were not on the same line. They were involved in communication. And I can understand that, because once he began a conversation with me by correspondence, there was no stopping. It was just constantly one after another. In fact, when I went to Africa, I had a file that thick of correspondence between Al and me. But at any rate, Al did arrange with the brethren. He called them up and told them that Bob was here, that he had wanted to arrange for him to see the brethren and have a discussion with them, but he had arrived ahead of time. So they did make arrangements for Bob to go to Washington, D.C. to see the officers, and Al went with him. What happened there was that they had fairly good conversations, but when they asked Bob a question, he lied to them, and Al knew he was lying, and it was a very significant outright lie, and this was a shock to Al that he would do so, And it became, it was the first of the awakenings that Al had regarding Bob and his message. Eventually, Al would recognize, by the way, Al went from place to place with him, but eventually Al Hudson recognized that there was a problem with Bob and his message, and he did break away from him. Now, one morning I was still in bed when I received a phone call. That phone call was from Al. Al said, "We're down here at the Tonasket Motel. I have with me Bob and John Brinsmead, and would like to have you listen to Bob. Could you and Vern come to my motel room and listen to him present his message?" Well, I got up and dressed and went down to the motel, and Vern was there when I arrived. So we listened to Bob, and he presented probably a 2-hour lecture. During that period of time, I chose not to interrupt him, to give him full time, but I had one question that I wanted to ask him. There was only one. He did an excellent job of treating the court as a presentation of the justification. He also did a good job of presenting the significance of the most holy place as the place of judgment, a time of judgment. But what he didn't say a word about was the holy place. Now, between the court and the most holy place, as you know, you can't get to the most holy place without going through the holy place. I wondered, why did he skip that entirely? He just ignored it, presenting an excellent message here and one there, rather extensive, and I found that he had a great deal of knowledge for a young man. I was a young man, but he was a little younger than I. He was about the age of my younger brother, and I had spent a considerable amount of time studying the sanctuary myself, and I felt that what he presented was very good, but he left out a very vital part, a part that was necessary in order to join the other two together. So I waited until he finished. And when he finished, I said, "Well, Bob, I have just one question." He said, "What is that?" And I said, "Why did you not connect the holy place with why didn't you connect the court and the most holy place with the holy place?" He answered me in 2 words: "That's legalism." Those are the only 2 words that he spoke to me. I listened for 2 hours to him, but he simply said, "That's legalism," and took his things out to the car and left, heading for Canada. We were right there at Oroville, which is right along the Canadian line. I wondered what would cause him to say that's legalism. At that point, I didn't understand, but I would find out later. In the meantime, I also learned something else later, and that is that when Bob began his preaching, he began it in Australia. And at that time, he had considerable difficulty with the church because of his preaching on active perfection. In other words, that we must become perfect, and preaching on how to become perfect. When he came to America, he changed his focus. It was no longer active perfection, but passive perfection. I rather think The reason was that he had been studying the Minneapolis Message, and it was studying the Minneapolis Message, I think that it was a result of reading Bob Wieland's material that caused that. But he now was focusing in America on passive perfection. Now you may say, what's active perfection and what's passive perfection? I don't know that anyone has used those terms but me, but they're important. Active perfection has to do with what I must do actively in order to become perfect. Passive perfection has to do with what I must receive in order to become perfect. Now, the Minneapolis Message brings these two principles together, and both of the principles are essential. It's not either active or passive. It is a passive reception of Christ's righteousness that permits us to actively seek to become like Christ without becoming legalistic. Now, where is my perfection? My perfection lies in whom? In Christ, not in myself. Now, when I understand that He is my perfection, and I receive Him, what am I receiving? I'm receiving His perfection, but am I perfect yet? No. No. I have much growth to make. But if I truly receive Christ and receive His perfection, I must love what He loves, or I will love what He loves. I will not resist what He loves. And the Bible shows that Christ loved obedience and hated disobedience. So that is, the Minneapolis Message is very simple. We receive Christ, receiving Him, we receive His righteousness, not because we have become righteous, but because we claim His righteousness. And when we do that honestly, we choose to become that way. It is not a matter of a dishonest situation where we claim His righteousness while continuing to live unrighteously. We claim His righteousness, we claim Him and His righteousness because that's what we want. And we choose to become active in our relationship to His perfection. Now, without having chosen His righteousness, seeking to become perfect leads inevitably to legalism, because it's my righteousness I'm trying to perfect. When I accept Christ's righteousness, it's His righteousness I'm seeking to internalize. I'm seeking to live by the principles of His righteousness, but it's no longer my own righteousness that I'm seeking to perfect. I'm simply seeking to receive it in practical reality. Now, when Bob changed from active to passive, he undoubtedly thought he was preaching the Minneapolis Message, but he was not. Because you cannot preach the Minneapolis Message and resist becoming like Christ. Why did he say that the connecting the court with the most holy place would be legalism? That's legalism, he said. Why would you suppose he would say that? What does the holy place symbolize? It symbolizes Christian growth. And if it symbolizes Christian growth, then ultimately it does represent perfection, and it represents how we receive Christ's righteousness. There is the lampstand. The lights represent whom? Christ, the light of the world. And there is the altar of incense. What does that represent? It represents Christ's mercies, are claiming his merits by prayer. And what does the table of showbread represent? It represents the bread of life. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. So the bread, the candlesticks, the altar of incense, all three represent the basic, together represent the basic ingredients of accepting and internalizing Christ's righteousness. Now, what was Brinsmead's view? Brinsmead's view had changed from Australia to America. And the interesting thing is his followers didn't even understand that change at all. But it had changed from active perfection, which leads to legalism, unless we have the Minneapolis understanding. He had changed to a passive obedience and passive perfection, which does not work unless it is connected with the active perfection. When we receive Christ's righteousness, it is not merely a legal thing. Bob was treating it as a legal thing, but when I receive Christ's righteousness, it's because I receive him who is righteous. It's a personal reception of Christ. And it's that personal reception of Christ that permits him, by my choice, to begin working in my life to establish these three elements that are essential to growth. One is prayer. Let's start with Bible study, the table of showbread. Then there is prayer, and that prayer is intercessory prayer, which claims Christ's merits in our behalf. And third is what? Obedience, witness. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, but that's not all he said. He said, you are the light of the world. Now, when he was speaking to his disciples and said, you are the light of the world, how could they be the light of the world when he says, I am the light of the world? Very simple, because when they receive Christ and his righteousness, they receive his light. His light is seen in their obedient life, reflecting the righteousness of Christ. So this was the issue at that time, and Bob Brinsmead had changed from active, which leads, when alone, leads to legalism, to a passive, which leads to antinomianism, which means that it leads to disobedience rather than to obedience. But when these two unite, because we receive Christ himself and invite him into our lives and ask him to give us both the motives and the power to obey, this is the basis of Christian growth and the ultimate perfection which the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy call for. Now, I mentioned before that his followers did not understand. His followers did not have an adequate concept of Minneapolis either, but they were focused on the active. And there was not even, they weren't, for some reason, were not even aware, because he was called for perfection. But how did he call for it? All right, it was this: that you enter the most holy place. Now notice we bypassed the holy place. You enter the most holy place and wait there until the Holy Spirit falls upon you. And then you become perfect. bypassing the holy place, which actually tells a story of growth. It tells us how we are to become perfect. But in this case, he had denied that as being what? Legalistic. Why did he think it was legalistic? Because he was relating it to his own active perfection without understanding the passive element of receiving Christ and his righteousness and depending on him. And by the way, no matter how much you might receive the righteousness of Christ, you're still going to be judged not on the basis of your own performance, but on the basis of Christ's own righteousness. You are judged in him. It's his character that is being judged according to God's plan. His character has already been judged and proven perfect. And when you are in him, then you are as good as passed through the judgment. Those who are in Christ are in his kingdom, and those will be in his kingdom. Those who are not in Christ are in themselves. And in themselves, it doesn't matter how actively perfect we become. It doesn't matter what perfect things we do or how good we do them, because those will not pass. God asks for perfection, and Christ is the only one who has that perfection. We can receive Christ and become perfect while we're seeking to become perfect. Does that make sense? We receive his righteousness, which is perfection. Are we yet perfect? No, but in God's eyes we are perfect. Indeed, we're told that God looks to us as though we had never sinned. So, with this in mind, I'm going to continue and would comment to begin with that at this point I did not know anything about the Minneapolis message. I did know the Minneapolis message, but didn't know anything about it. Does that make sense? How did I know it? I did not know it because I knew anything about it. I knew nothing about it, but I knew the message. How would I know the message? Can you guess? Do you remember at 15, what the Lord led me to do? Take 1 hour every morning, 1 hour every evening to study and pray. And what did I use as my basic focus, to focus? Desire of ages. It was years later that I understood Minneapolis, that I understood about it. And it was long years after that I realized that Steps to Christ was Ellen White's first summary of the Minneapolis Principles, and Desire of Ages was an extensive presentation. I was a devout student of the Desire of Ages. I was studying it prayerfully. I spent many hours, even on a single page, praying and listening to the Holy Spirit. Do you suppose he spoke to me? Yes. Do you suppose he spoke to me about what was on Ellen White's heart? Yes. And it was long before I knew anything about the Minneapolis message, but I was internalizing it all that time. And that, by the way, is a key to Christian growth, is that we are studying God's Word, praying earnestly, and seeking to follow the principles which makes us a witness to others. You are the light of the world. And so it was that I had learned these from Desire of Ages. Now, I mentioned before that Bob arrived on February of 1961. And it was a very short time before Al brought him to my district. I had a chance of listening to him for a couple of hours. I've never seen him again since then. I've never had any chance to have conversation with him, but I listened to 2 hours of his message and asked one question and got a 2-word answer. That's legalism. It was later that I would realize what caused him to say that, because later on I realized that he felt that any effort on the part of human beings results in legalism. Young folk, legalism is not caused by effort. It's caused by a lack of the Holy Spirit's presence. When I seek to become perfect without surrender my life, my heart, my all to the Holy Spirit, to Christ and His Spirit, then I inevitably become legalistic. The key to righteousness, right doing by faith, is surrender to Christ and His Spirit. It is the Holy Spirit that both prompts me to want to do right, He motivates me to do right, and empowers me to do right. Is that legalism? No, that's not legalism. The one who is connected with Christ through the Holy Spirit has able to put forth vastly greater effort than the one who is out, because that person becomes very discouraged. I was in that state for 8 years before my conversion. I tried my best to become good enough for Christ to accept. I never thought about becoming perfect, but I thought I must be good enough for Him to accept, and I never was able to convince myself that I was good enough, thank God. And I've often thanked God for not allowing me to have the sense of self-righteousness that I would have gratefully accepted at that time. I would have been happy to have had that sense of self-righteousness, but I couldn't. And that was God's own doings, because I am self-righteous by nature. That's my nature. I like to think of myself as good and righteous. But the important thing is for me to think of Him as good, as righteous. And for me to find my assurance by my relationship to Him, not by my performance. If I'm basing it on performance, it's certainly going to be legalistic. If I base my assurance upon His performance and His promises and commitment to me, then I'm going to be able to grow, and as the holy place portrays, through studying God's Word, intercessory prayer, and witness, obedience. Now, when Bob was in Australia, he had a primary opponent. That primary opponent was Desmond Ford. Desmond Ford was the one who especially opposed Bob and his views. And by the way, I don't know if I completely explained his position. I'm going to do it again in case I didn't complete it. Bob's view was you go into the most holy place and wait there until suddenly the Holy Spirit falls upon you, removes your sinful nature, and now you're perfect. Now, the perfection that the Bible teaches and that the Spirit of prophecy teaches is very different from that. Perfection that the Word of God teaches is that we begin by claiming Christ's righteousness. And when we claim Christ's righteousness, we are accepted by God as though we were perfect. So at that point, I have perfect right to assurance. I can be assured that I am accepted of Christ, not because I'm so good, but because Christ is good. And it's that relationship with Him that permits me to put forth efforts, and they're efforts of the will, by the way, rather than of the body, to will to do His will. And by the way, it takes tremendous effort because Satan is very, very deceptive and has a way of making it very difficult for us even to choose that which we know is right. But when I am claiming His righteousness, I have a perfect freedom now to put forth the utmost effort to do what He wants me to do without being in danger of becoming legalistic, because I have His motivation, His power to depend upon, and not my own. But at any rate, in Australia, Desmond Ford was his primary opponent. But when he came to America, he faced another primary opposer, and that was, what did we do here? That was Edward Heppenstall. Now, Edward Heppenstall was one of the key men at the seminary. And Edward Heppenstall was the mentor of Desmond Ford. Now, their position was certainly not the Minneapolis message, because their position is that you will sin until Christ comes, and that His righteousness covers you, but you will continue sinning until Christ comes. Now that's may seem to avoid legalism, but it doesn't. Because if you believe that, then you believe you're doomed to sin until Christ comes, and any effort you put forth then will become legalistic because of your focus. You're not going to be depending on Christ's righteousness. You're going to seek, and everyone seeks at least some level of righteousness. That is, it matters not how low the goal you put, you still have something that you will not want to do, if nothing else, because it's embarrassing. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it doesn't matter whether you have a liberal view or conservative view. If you have any kind of moral commitment, that becomes legalistic unless you're looking to Christ for your righteousness. So it matters not, a person can assume that they're getting rid of legalism by just deciding that it's all right because Christ's righteousness makes up everything. But brothers and sisters, to honestly claim Christ's righteousness, unless you honestly claim it, you're not claiming it, because Christ's righteousness is honest. Honesty is a major ingredient in His righteousness. Therefore, any failure to be honest with yourself and with God denies Christ's righteousness. So, now, when Brinsmead came to the United States, sometime after that, he was disfellowshipped. It's my understanding that his membership was still in Australia at that time, but at any rate, he was no longer counted as a member of the church, but he continued preaching the same doctrine that he had before, and was preaching on, I don't know if it was radio or TV, but he was preaching in Daniel and the Antichrist, and he identified the papacy as the Antichrist. And a listener, one person who was listening was Jeffrey Paxton. And Jeffrey said, I wonder, I think I'll give that man a call. And he did. He called Bob and he said, I'd like to have you come over and discuss this with me. Bob went over and discussed with him. It just happened that Paxton was a Plymouth Brethren theologian. And you know from our class what Plymouth Brethren position is. So it wasn't very long in their discussion before Bob realized that his position really was a Plymouth Brethren position, because that's the approach the Plymouth Brethren have. And so it wasn't long before he began to really take an interest in Paxton's theology. And there was someone else that began to study with them. Desmond Ford's wife, his first wife, was dying of cancer. And Bob Brinsmead's wife was a nurse and had invited her into her home to care for her during her last months. So Desmond would frequently come to Bob Brinsmead's home, and when there would spend some time talking with Brinsmead. And it was during this period of time that Paxton came into Brinsmead's life and very soon became involved in Desmond Ford's life. So what happened was that Desmond Ford, along with Brinsmead, became devotees of the Plymouth Brethren religion. And that Plymouth Brethren religion, in this issue we're talking about, had to do with justification at the cross. We're justified at the cross. We're judged, in fact, the way they put it, they have judged the cross and justified at the cross, and there's no more judgment. So if we were already justified at the cross, then there can be no judgment, and we don't need to worry about perfection. You see what I'm saying? So this is the only judgment that the Christian faces is at the cross, and if you've accepted Christ, then you already have passed the judgment. This is the Plymouth Brethren viewpoint. Now, when Desmond Ford's first wife died, he very soon left Australia and went to England to get a doctorate in Manchester. While his wife was still alive, he had been in contact with the Manchester School of Divinity and decided to go there. And it was there that he met F.F. Bruce. Now, F.F. Bruce at the time was the world's most famous Plymouth Brethren. And it was F.F. Bruce who wrote the foreword to Ford's book Daniel. When Ford got his doctoral degree, it was by writing a dissertation which was published as Daniel. In that, Ford upholds the Futurist position, but does not deny the Preterist position of Antiochus Epiphanes. If you remember, the view is that Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was about 200 years before Christ, was the Antichrist, and that his persecution of the Jewish church was what Daniel's talking about. Indeed, their view is that Daniel was not written by a man named Daniel who lived 4 centuries before. It was written by an unknown person who called himself Daniel and wrote under that term, but that this was not prophecy but history. In other words, he was writing what had just taken place rather than writing the prophecy of the future. And this was the view, the Antiochus view. Now, when Des wrote his book, what he did was to defend historicism, but also subtly upholding the Antiochus view as being also significant, not being not presenting it fully as prophetic or whatever, but also significant. Now, the fact is that this couldn't have been Antiochus, because when Jesus was here, he spoke of the abomination of desolation as being yet future. You'll find that in Matthew 24, verse 15 and onward. However, this was what Desmond Ford accepted. Now, about this time, I was at Columbia Union College. I was teaching there, and our son had so many problems that he needed to get away from the academic scenario completely. He had a problem with dyslexics and was unable to read and was a teenager by this time. So when asked to direct the Levita mission, I went out there to take a look at it, and decided the Lord was leading us there, where David could work in the garage and so forth. And when I returned, Colin Standish was our president, by the way, of Columbia Union College at that time. And Colin, I told him what my decision was. He accepted that. He knew I would likely do that. Anyway, he asked me a question: do you know Desmond Ford? Well, I didn't know Desmond Ford, but I had seen that name. I was sure I'd seen it in print. It's a very different name. Ford is quite a common name, and the name of a, an automobile, and Desmond was not a common name, but one that Desmond T. Doss, Desmond T. Doss, yes. I knew the name, and this caused me to sort of remember it. I didn't remember who it was, but his next statement was, he is Adventist's greatest theologian, and he's a heretic. Well, that was my introduction to Des Ford. Our next class will have to do with Desmond Ford, but I have shared my introduction to it this time because I want to spend my time on Wednesday dealing with the issue of universal justification at the cross. I will have much less to say about the man than about the view. But at any rate, I did not know anything about him, and so Colin took out a folder with all kinds of materials in it, a big folder like this, and let me use it. And then after I had spent some time going through it, he went through and gave me a large number of seconds. When he had two things, he would let me have one of them. This was an important part of my preparation because Desmond Ford was preaching a doctrine I didn't know. I needed to get acquainted with him, and this was all these materials were things that either he had written or preached or were involved in the debate between him and others. So I did become acquainted with him in that way. Later on, a few years later, when I was working on my doctoral degree, I had done my master's thesis, and my professor, who had been a graduate from New York University, told me, he said, your master's thesis could very well serve your doctoral thesis. Well, I had no intention of doing that, but I did have in mind exactly what I was going to do, and I was going to present similar principles, but I was going to use various historical characters to compare and contrast with. Well, the fact is that when I went to Washington, D.C. one weekend to do some research there, I found out that a man by the name of Jeffrey Paxton was supposed to come in the next weekend and was going to give a whole series of lectures. Well, I was doing my work at New York University, which isn't that far away, So I decided to come back again, which I did, and spent the weekend. And after I had listened to his public lectures, Colin Standish again asked me, said, Leroy, he says, one of my students has just told me of a secret meeting that Des is going to have with his followers. I wonder if you'd like to go with me, to go. I said, well, yes. So I went with my notebook and my pencil ready to take notes. The fact is that I very soon wished I had a recorder, because everything that Paxton was saying was extremely important. What I didn't realize was that Paxton knew a lot more about Adventists than I thought. I kept thinking when he's presenting his lectures that if you only understood the sanctuary principles, you would understand that what you're presenting is not accurate. But he did know what Adventists believed, and that night he began with this statement. He said, Des Ford, and then he named one of the other Australian theologians, are developing new theology in Adventism. And those are just about his exact words. Then he said this, Des says that Ballinger is the way we must go. No, next statement he made was, they are putting 31 and 1844 together. Do you know what that means? It means that what we believe happened in 1844 already happened in 31. They're putting them together. That means that Des and this other theologian was denying the judgment hour message. Well, then his next statement was that Des Ford says that Ballinger is the way we must go. And that's pretty much the wording, the way we must go. From that point on, he presented Desmond Ford's theology, a rejection of the sanctuary message. Now, Desmond Ford had been accused of denying the sanctuary message for years. And he had satisfied my mind that the accusations were not accurate. He had done a very good job of certainly of convincing me. But now I'm listening to to Paxton. He is representing Desmond Ford right there in that lecture. And now he dismantles the sanctuary message. And how does he do it? By using Ellen White's statements. A series of 7 statements which are taken out of context and oftentimes only part of a sentence. Use those to indicate that Ellen White was in the process of denying her own message. And if she had only lived, she would be preaching well, he didn't say Plymouth Brethren, there's no indication of that, but I later found out that this was the Plymouth Brethren. Everything that Desmond was presenting through Paxton at this point was actually Plymouth Brethren theology. Now, when I got through and went back to my room, I was very distressed. It was late at night, but I got on the phone and called Elder Robert Pearson. Even though it was late, I felt an urgency of telling him what I just heard. He says, can you come to my office at probably 8 o'clock in the morning? I don't remember the time. But I said yes, so I was there. When I got there, his secretary came to me and she said, well, Elder Pearson has asked me to give you his apologies, but he was called out to one of the foreign divisions last night, had to leave by airplane, and has left his dictaphone and asked me to have you present what you heard last night. So I did. But when I got back to New York, I still was thinking of the ministry magazine. Bob Spangler was the editor of Ministry, and I knew that Bob had said something about an upcoming article in Ministry by Ford. And I thought, I need to call him, and I did. His answer was, Leroy, I can't believe it. He and I were acquainted, so we were first-name basis. I called him Bob, and he called me Leroy. He said, I just can't believe it. He says, I've been co-speaker with him all over the world. We've traveled together, we've preached together, and he has been a big help to me in my diet and so forth. But he says, I'll tell you what you do. You write out what you've shared with me, and I'll get together with him and find out. So weeks passed. I did just that, by the way, right away. And weeks passed, I didn't hear anything. And finally, I got a phone call from Bob, and he said, Leroy, I finally got up with Bob, and this is his wording. I got up with him. I took your material and removed your name and went through the whole thing with me. And Des says he's being misrepresented. I thought that's a bit strange. If he's misrepresented by the one who's come all the way to America to defend him. So a few days later, I got something in the mail. I got a letter saying, Leroy, I thought you'd be, I've just got a letter from Bob. I'm sorry. I just got a letter from Des, and I thought you'd be interested in this paragraph. And that paragraph said, I have been misrepresented. I have spent 20 years refuting Ballinger in my classes, and about 3 or 4, those about the 2 I remember, but there were about 4 different things claiming misrepresentation. Well, I thought, I'm going to have to accept that, although I don't believe it's possible, but I cannot do a dissertation on his work and still think of him as a liar. You know what I'm saying? I can't do that. And so I put this out of my mind, and I went ahead with the presentation. And I was thinking that was the end. Time for us to be closing. We will discuss Ford's theology of universal justification at the cross next time. But in the meantime, I've shared with you my story as far as it has yet gone. As it was, I have spent some time with Desmond Ford, and I'll share that with you the next time. Shall we bow our heads? Father, thank you for your many blessings. I pray tonight for your special blessing upon each student, and that you'll help them understand the issues as they continue to play out, and that they may each understand how to relate to you personally, to receive your righteousness and to grow in it, and to understand the doctrines of Scripture. In the name of Jesus, amen.